There is a phrase that survived the man who inspired it. Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal at the gates. Roman parents used it when children misbehaved. Senators used it when politics turned unstable. It was spoken in fear, in anger, in warning. Over time, it stopped being a literal description and became something darker, a code for the feeling that danger is close, control is slipping, and the old certainties no longer hold. That alone tells you how unusual Hannibal Barca was. Most generals leave battlefields behind them. Hannibal left a permanent mark on Rome's nervous system. We know the surface details. He spent years on Italian soil, far from home, cut off from real reinforcements, facing a state that could raise new armies almost at will. He destroyed Roman forces that, on paper, should have rolled over him. Legion after legion marched out believing they would end him. None of them did. But the real story is not just that he beat Roman armies. It is that he learned how the Roman mind worked, and then turned that knowledge into a weapon. He didn't rely on numbers or miracles. He relied on Roman pride, Roman hunger for glory, Roman faith in their own invincibility. He watched how they thought, how they chose, how they reacted when insulted, and then he built his entire campaign around making those instincts work against them. For 15 years, Rome lived with one man in its head. This is how Hannibal Barca made an empire feel hunted inside its own borders. Long before Hannibal set foot in Italy, Rome had already given him his sharpest weapon. Roman aristocrats were raised on stories of ancestors who had won empires with a sword in one hand and destiny in the other. A man's career moved along the cursus honorum, the ladder of offices, and every rung was greased with blood. If you wanted real power in Rome, you did not rely on books or speeches alone. You took an army into the field and came back with victory. Without that, your name disappeared. Hannibal understood that this culture did not just produce brave commanders. It produced men who could not live with the idea of passing through history unnoticed. So when Sempronius Longus arrived in Italy, Hannibal did not see the Roman consul. He saw a man with a calendar ticking in his head. His term was ending, his chance for glory narrowing with each cold morning. Hannibal sent raiders across the river not because they would do serious damage, but because they would offend exactly the kind of man Sempronius was. Proud, impatient, still imagining the triumphal procession that might be waiting for him in Rome. Sempronius took the bait. He dragged his men through icy water at dawn, half frozen, half fed, all of them moving not for strategic necessity, but for one man's need to be remembered. Hannibal waited with rested troops and an ambush arranged in layers. The outcome was decided before the first javelin flew. Flaminius was cut from the same cloth. Hannibal burned his way through Etruria, knowing exactly what it would do to a magistrate who saw himself as the guardian of Italy. Every farm that went up in flames was a personal insult. Flaminius pursued in a fury, his sense of responsibility fused with wounded pride, until he rode his army straight into a fog-covered valley where Carthaginian troops already held the heights. Again, the pattern repeated. A Roman leader driven less by calculation than by the terror of seeming passive, hesitant, forgettable. By the time Hannibal faced the massive Roman force at Cannae, he no longer needed to guess how his opponents would behave. He knew that, given the chance, they would always choose the path that promised decisive, glorious victory. All he had to do was offer that promise in a form that looked irresistible from a Roman camp and fatal from his own.
Hannibal understood that killing Roman soldiers was only the surface of the work. The deeper task was to kill something inside Rome that had lived unchallenged for generations. The quiet confidence that, whatever happened, The legions would arrive, and reality would snap back into order. After Trebia, after Trasimene, after Cannae, the numbers were terrifying, but the real damage happened in the silence that followed each disaster. News traveled faster than armies. Families waited for sons who did not return. Senators counted up the dead and realized they were not just losing men, but entire networks of experience and influence. The Republic was not just bleeding, it was forgetting parts of itself. Hannibal made sure the fear did not stay confined to battlefields. He moved through Italy with the calm of someone who knew Rome could not pin him down. Sometimes he raided close to the city, letting his presence brush the edge of their pride, then disappeared before a formal confrontation could be arranged. Once, he camped near enough that Romans could see his fires from the walls, then marched away as if the capital of his enemy mattered less than his own plans. That gesture was worth more than any sack. It told Rome, "Your center is not sacred. Your safety is not assumed. I decide when and where you feel threatened." He added another layer by reshaping how Italy saw Rome. Roman prisoners, the very citizens the Republic claimed to protect, were handled with cold severity. Non-Roman Italians captured fighting for Rome were often released, sometimes even courted. Word spread that Rome demanded everything and guaranteed nothing, while Hannibal offered alternatives that looked, if not noble, at least rational. Cities began to hesitate. Some chose defection, others simply delayed sending troops, but the pattern was the same. Each act of doubt told Hannibal his slow work was taking hold. Rome's strength had always depended on a web of loyalty reinforced by fear of Roman punishment and trust in Roman power. Hannibal left the punishment intact and attacked the trust. Over 15 years, the effect was cumulative. Merchants, farmers, magistrates, allied leaders, all lived with the knowledge that somewhere in their own country moved a commander their armies had failed to stop. The phrase Hannibal ante portas was not about a man at the gate. It was about the realization that the gate itself might no longer mean safety. He did not need to burn Rome to make it feel exposed. He only had to prove, again and again, that the world the Romans thought they controlled could be unsettled by a single foreign mind moving freely through their heartland.
For centuries, Rome had trained itself to believe that discipline could tame uncertainty. Their roads straightened the landscape, their camps imposed geometry on wilderness, their legions moved like a single organism drilled to respond the same way, every time, to familiar orders. That predictability was their comfort and their weapon. Hannibal's mind moved in the opposite direction. He understood that if Rome drew its strength from order, then he had to become the embodiment of everything order could not easily absorb. The decision to cross the Alps was the clearest expression of this instinct. Strategically, it was brutal. Hostile tribes, deadly weather, men and animals dying along the way. Psychologically, it was perfect. No Roman planner seriously constructed scenarios around a Carthaginian army emerging from those mountains onto Italian soil. The Alps had been treated as a natural wall. Hannibal treated them as a door only he was willing to walk through. When he emerged, battered, reduced, but present, he had already done something vital. He had proven that Rome's mental map of the world was incomplete. That became the template. Each major move in Italy carried the same quiet message. You do not know what I will do next, and your usual methods of prediction are useless. One season, he would devastate the countryside to draw a consul out of position. Another, he would vanish from sight for weeks, forcing the Senate to guess whether he had turned north, south, or simply melted into the hills to wait. On the battlefield, the same logic governed his choices. Where Romans expected simple lines colliding until one side broke, Hannibal folded the field like fabric. A line that seemed to give way was often part of a larger pattern.
A weak point was sometimes a lure. Units appeared from dust or fog where no serious Roman commander would have placed them, because Roman commanders were still thinking in terms of symmetry and directness. Even the more theatrical elements, the elephants, the sudden appearances in places believed safe, the stories of strange tricks in later campaigns, fed into this aura. Men who think they understand the rules fight with a certain posture. Men who are no longer sure what can happen next tighten up, hesitate, become slower in small, almost invisible ways. For 15 years, Rome lived with the sense that it was always one step behind a man who seemed to read from a different rule book. The true chaos was not on the field, it was in the Roman realization that their habits, their doctrines, their sense of how war was supposed to unfold could all be rewritten by someone who refused to behave according to their expectations. Rome did not just see itself as powerful, it saw itself as inevitable. From the earliest stories told to Roman children, the message was simple and relentless. We endure what others cannot. We come back from disasters that would break lesser peoples. We do not bow, we do not yield, and in the end we prevail because we are Roman. That belief sat beneath their politics, their religion, their military system. It was less a thought than a reflex. Hannibal attacked that reflex. Each time he destroyed a Roman army, he chipped away at the idea that Roman courage and discipline granted automatic superiority. At Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae, it was not just the dead who mattered, but the conversations afterward. Men in togas sitting in shaded courtyards, asking questions they had never needed to ask. Were their gods still with them? Were their tactics as timeless as they had believed? Were their leaders truly chosen for merit, or simply pushed forward by ambition and chance? Hannibal understood something else about Rome. The same political machinery that made it flexible also made it vulnerable. Two consuls sharing command, each serving for a year, meant that armies were sometimes led by men whose main qualification was timing. A brilliant enemy could watch the rotation of office and choose moments when arrogance or inexperience stood at the top of the state. Hannibal learned the rhythm of their elections and treated it as another aspect of the terrain. But his greatest impact was not in exposing flaws in procedure. It was in forcing Rome to become something it had spent centuries despising. After Cannae, facing the stark possibility of collapse, Rome turned to Fabius Maximus and a strategy its own people initially mocked. No more heroic charges, no more grand battles decided in a single afternoon. Instead, Shadow Hannibal cut his supplies when possible, refused to give him the kind of confrontation he excelled at, absorbed the shame of watching him move across Italian soil almost unchallenged. To adopt that approach was to confess, at least internally, that Rome could not currently beat this man in a straight fight. It required a new definition of Roman courage. Not the courage of the decisive blow, but the slower, grimmer courage of restraint, endurance, and waiting while an enemy desecrated the very landscape that defined your identity. In that moment, Hannibal had already accomplished something irreversible. He had bent Rome away from its own preferred image. The republic that emerged on the other side of the war was harder, more calculating, less intoxicated with the idea that Roman virtue alone guaranteed victory. It learned to think about logistics, to study enemy minds with a seriousness that previously might have seemed almost dishonorable, to use time as a weapon, instead of assuming time was on its side by default. Hannibal did not live to see the final shape of the power he had helped refine, yet the arc is clear. A state that entered the conflict believing in its natural supremacy left it knowing, on a very deep level, that supremacy had to be defended with intelligence as well as faith. He had turned their identity from a comfortable story into a more sober, more dangerous understanding of what survival actually required. When people say Hannibal ante portas now, it sounds like a dramatic flourish, a phrase from some distant war. For the Romans who first used it, it was a memory of a time when one man had reached so far into their collective mind
that they measured their fears against his name. Hannibal did not overturn Rome. The city endured, rebuilt its armies, carried the war back to his homeland, and wrote its version of the story into history. Yet beneath the Roman triumph lay an uncomfortable fact that no victory parade could erase. For years, their finest commanders, their proudest legions, their most trusted habits had been led around Italy by a foreign general who understood them more clearly than they understood themselves. He had taken their craving for glory and made it predictable. He had taken their alliances and tested the glue that held them together. He had taken their belief in order and confronted it with a style of war that refused to follow their rules. Most of all, he had taken their identity, that hard, polished sense of destiny, and forced them to live without it long enough to feel what vulnerability actually was. Rome adapted and survived because it had the population, the resources, the institutional depth to absorb punishment until a new pattern emerged. Hannibal never found a way to convert his brilliance into lasting security for his own people. Yet when you look at the shape of the Roman Republic after him, colder in its calculations, sharper in its suspicion, more attentive to the minds of its enemies, you can still see his outline. Hannibal Barca lost his war and his world, but he achieved something rarer. He made the greatest power of his age rethink itself, not through philosophy or persuasion, but through the relentless pressure of a single, disciplined mind refusing to behave as it was supposed to. That is why, centuries later, his name survives not as a footnote in Roman glory, but as the shadow that forced Rome to grow teeth behind its confidence. If this analysis has deepened your understanding of leadership and power, I'd appreciate you subscribing for more explorations of history's most consequential figures. Thank you for watching.